All right, everybody, it's time for another Adult Children of Alcoholics podcast, and we are at the end of the laundry list. The laundry list, the 14 traits that are used in adult children of alcoholics and dysfunction. Stephen and I have been going over it for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, two at a time. And the final two, the final two are interesting. They talk about para-alcoholism.
Yes, yeah. This is going to be something that we're going to kind of, I think, have a fun discussion about today because I don't remember if we have mentioned this on previous podcasts. If you've listened to them or folks at home have listened to them, we've worked through each of these traits, and you guys will know that Billy and I run ACA groups here in treatment at Wellness Wellness. And usually in the groups that we run here, we'll split them up over the course of multiple days because, as you can imagine, there's a lot to discuss in all these traits. And in most weeks, we actually don't even get to traits 13 and 14. We actually don't discuss them in groups a lot. So I'm actually kind of just curious about where our discussion is going to go today. But as we say at the start of all these, if for whatever reason this is your first podcast that you're jumping into, this will make a lot more sense if you go back to the beginning. There's an overview podcast we do talking about what the laundry list traits are, a little bit about what ACA groups are like, and then we've been doing traits two at a time over the weeks that you can go back and listen to.
Yeah, so you should have, before this one, there should be 7.
Yeah. So should we just jump right on in to
Oh, yeah, talk about it.
Okay, so trait 13, the laundry list says, alcoholism is a family disease, and we became para-alcoholics and took on the characteristics of that disease, even though we did not pick up the drink. So this is, remember, we've been talking about this over the course of the weeks, and people can look up online. ACA is now called Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunction or Dysfunctional Families. When it was originally founded in 1978, it was just Adult Children of Alcoholics. And these 14 traits that the founder, Tony A., wrote, he wrote those in 1978. This was kind of what started it all. And so at the time, you hear he's just referring to alcoholism. I think you could replace that with addiction more broadly. So addiction's a family disease, and we became para-addicts or something like that. But what it's trying to describe is people who took on all of the emotional and maybe some of even the behavioral characteristics of addiction, even though they never actually developed like an addiction to, alcohol, substances, gambling, whatever. And what I think is interesting about that as a concept is that a lot of the things that we talk about in traits 1 through 12 are in the behaviors of addiction.
You know what I mean?
So in many ways, I think trait 13 is kind of summarizing almost the whole laundry list as a whole. But you can go back and listen to all of our podcasts, and you can hear countless examples we've talked about. If you grew up with a caretaker or someone in the family who has issues with addiction, you are going to have your own set of responses to that. Because we can pretend that people can hide things and they can keep it to themselves. But in families, stuff seeps out, it spreads out. So if, my dad was an alcoholic, for example, and he has lots of issues with anger because of that, you bet that anger is going to affect me in some way. And then even if I don't become an alcoholic myself, I've got my own set of reactions and behaviors that I developed to manage his anger that I might have carried with me in adulthood. So that's kind of what I think the laundry list is referring to in a nutshell. I'm curious to hear your take on just like what you think about the concept, or maybe even just like examples.
Well, and the first thing I would say is let's look at the other side of it.
Yeah.
If I grow up with a father that I watch, when things come up in life, he stays calm and collected, researches what needs to be done, talks people through emotional situations, that type of thing. The likelihood of me becoming like that to some degree is pretty high. If I have a mother who does something, whatever she does wonderfully, the likelihood of me being better in some of those areas is high.
Yeah.
So it works the same the other way.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, if what I am witnessing is very stressful, a lot of fear, a lot of addiction, the likelihood of me taking on how they are is extremely high.
Yeah, I think that gets to the modeling that we've talked a lot about in these podcasts. So like, we all know that human beings learn through observation. And so what we see other people do somewhere in our brain says, oh, that's a way I can behave, or maybe what I think I should do. And that happens a lot throughout childhood. What I think is interesting, and maybe even people who do really relate to trait 13 might be people who saw all of those behaviors that like the chaos, the instability, the withdrawal, the excitement seeking, all these other things that can go with active addiction, saw all those things, but maybe somewhere in there thought themselves, but I'm never gonna drink because I think that's a horrible thing. And maybe they never do. But they did still see all the other behaviors that come with it. And don't get me wrong, you meet a lot of people. We've worked with a lot of people who swore they would never pick up a drink, they would never place a bet, they would never use, and they do. And there are people who do sometimes do that. But I've also met people who, some of whom are involved in ACA, who actually did say, I swore that I would never do that, and I've never touched a drop. Yet they still find a lot of problems, like in their relationships. Maybe they find a lot of codependency,
Emotional turmoil. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So trait 13 is really, I think, about that in those people. The other laundry list side, I think, is interesting because the other laundry list side says we refuse to admit that we've been affected by family dysfunction, or that there was dysfunction in the family home, or that we have internalized any of the family's destructive attitudes and behaviors. So this is like the denial side of trait 13. People who I say, I had an alcoholic mother, but it wasn't that bad, or I don't think it really affected me that much.
Right. That was a separate issue. I've heard that. Then that was different. That was a separate issue.
Yeah. No,
I don't think so.
when you said that, something like I've definitely heard that. Yeah, but that was totally separate.
Yeah.
Which I think is, maybe it's just a story that we like to tell ourselves. I sometimes wonder if there's a little bit of like our individualist culture that comes in. Like we think that everyone's an individual, and so we just sort of think that, oh, they have their stuff, I have mine. Doesn't have to have a connection. But anyone who grew up in a family knows that like you can say that all you want, but people's stuff does affect each other, whether we like to admit it.
Which is why it's so important for us to, understand how to ask questions that will help them see. I've had civil things like, but my dad and I had an okay relationship. Yeah, he was an alcoholic. Yeah, he ran around. He did a lot of things, but that was a separate issue. And then you start asking questions about, so you played baseball. Oh yeah, I played baseball, and and then they'll tell you stories of hitting home runs or whatever. And where was Dad? Oh, Dad wasn't at the game. Okay, yeah. So it didn't affect you at all. Are you sure about that? Show them.
Yeah, I try to tell clients sometimes that if we're really trying to take an honest look at ourselves, we can't work backwards from the result. So sometimes when people come in saying that, the narrative they already have is, I believe that what I have going on currently is not connected to what I experienced. And so then in their mind, they're working backwards from that, doing all of the math and justifying that narrative. Whereas I think I've said this in lots of podcasts, if we take a more like, let's try to be curious, let's try to take an honest look. I'm not going to make any assumptions about what the narrative is. I'm just going to look at what was. People are going to get a better idea what the impacts were.
Which that circles back to what I think I spoke about it in the overview when we first did this. The one common thing that I often say to people that we're getting ready to go over these lists with is, don't feel like you have to protect your parents. This does not make your parents good or bad or whatever. We're just asking you to see what life was like actually during that time, rather than minimize or, because the truth of it is, if you really do the work, you're going to go back and see that they were people just like you, and they were growing up, and, different things were going on. Maybe they had an addiction that they never got help for, and what's most important is that we understand what needs to change inside of us.
Yeah.
from having experienced those things.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you from, I mean, this is kind of, I think maybe even only a little bit attached to trait 13, but just on the subject of like when we experienced or saw our parents do something and we did different things, but they were kind of similar. Did you, as you done your recovery work, have you discovered ways that like, you know, your parents were doing things that you didn't do exactly what they did, but you kind of did a similar or variation of it?
Oh, plenty of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I would say that I'm not going to handle relationships the way my mother or my father did, and in various relationships along the way, I definitely did. You know, um, not wanting to, but I definitely did. Reactionary, which we're going to get into that here in a second, but you know, I when things would come up and my mother would just basically go hysterical. You know, I had a time in my life where that's how I acted. You know, um, if something big happens, like yeah, you know, I don't know, a super loud noise, something falls, whatever. In my girls will make fun of me sometimes because I can get jumpy in those moments, you know, and like be like, "What's that?" Yeah, you know that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And they'll say, you know, you're over the top when this happens or that happens or whatever. But I know growing up, I always saw stuff like that.
Yeah.
You know, just that everything was reactionary and oh man, it was a lot.
Did your father have issues with addiction, and did you see a lot of things with that? I know you've talked on this podcast.
Oh yeah. He had issues with. I mean, he definitely had a sex addiction for sure, like through the roof. But he also there was some alcohol, and some gambling also.
Yeah. And did you know about any of those things when you were growing up, or did you learn about that they were going on in the background when you got into adulthood?
I think the sex piece was so like so basically what was going on is he's running around with a lot of women in town. I'm hearing about it through other people, but also a lot like from my mom. I'm hearing my mom be miserable and voicing that. So that was kind of the heavy one.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I would see my dad drink too much, or I would see him, you know, go to bingo halls, play what they call pull tabs at bingo. Yeah, but it was more the sex piece. I
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think the that's just like an interesting, because like yeah, I mean I'm sure, I mean we could probably talk for hours about all of the like little differences that probably emerged. Like most people I think who experience, you know, dysfunction don't end up exactly like what they saw. They may recreate some behaviors that are like pretty darn close. But when you really look at the whole picture, you know, when people say, "Oh, I don't want to end up just like my father or become just like my mother," there are always some differences that emerge along the way. And I think that fear of I'm going to end up like them is actually one of the things that sometimes holds people back in the denial category. They're so afraid of being that, then they refuse to take a look at with the ways that they might be similar. But then the problem is they also don't get to recognize the ways they might be different.
Yeah.
So denial kind of just removes the possibility.
Yeah, it is, and some of that I learned more in recovery than I did because the one piece of the fear I think that was very helpful to me was when my first wife and I divorced. You know, I was just I was hell bent on I am not gonna not see my daughter, right? Which I believe. Yes, on the one hand, you could say, well, that's what a good father would do. I was also very addicted at the time. So I think having seen the way my father was very, very helpful to me in terms of keeping those visits and everything else up with my daughter. Because I definitely didn't want to be have a kid that was like me, that knew where his dad was and all that, and just never got to see him.
Yeah. Yeah. So even there, I think there's the difference then with like, I saw something happen and I knew I didn't want it to be me. So there's even positive changes, I think, that can come from that sort of stuff too.
Yep, to sure.
All right. Let's do trait 14. You want to read it?
All right, trait 14 says this: the laundry list. Para-alcoholics are reactors rather than actors.
Yeah. Yeah. This one's really simple, but I actually think it is a really like profound and important one. Most of what we've talked about in traits, pretty much every other trait on this laundry list, all the way from, isolating from authority figures to becoming approval seekers to fear of criticism, all of those different behavioral reactions and emotional reactions they're reactions. Like, they're usually things that are kind of coming up from our past. And when we're doing them, like we said countless times on this, people aren't consciously thinking about that. They're not consciously thinking, I'm going to go isolate because I hate conflict. They're just doing it. It's like a muscle memory thing. And the idea is that we want to move to the other side of becoming more actors. Like, we have a sense of awareness, of choice, of agency. And one of the ways that I like to think about this is like, acting out on our sort of like compulsive needs versus learning to act out of like choice and what do I want. So, I'm maybe to give an example, like, there's a situation with a potential conflict with someone. The reaction side of me, or the compulsive need, is I cannot have anyone be mad at me because of my past. I'm so afraid that if they're mad, they'll hate me, they will leave, and the relationship will end. And so my need is to avoid the conflict at all times. And so then how I act out of that is I isolate, I avoid the conversation, and I never try to address it. The want is, okay, I care about this person. I want them to stay. I value them. I care about them. And so when I'm acting from that place, I'm probably going to choose to do something very different than isolate myself and avoid. Well, if I want them to stay, what would make a person want to stay? If we talk about it, if I try to understand their perspective, if I make them feel listened to, if I try to change my behavior based on whatever the conflict is. See, all of those different things are things that I might choose to do. And that's the acting rather than the reacting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the other thing that I would put out there that I know, like personally for myself, was one of my ongoing complaints over the years would be, people are always doing things I don't want them to do, or and this or that. Remember when we went earlier in the laundry list where it talks about, if I speak up, I feel guilty and that kind of thing, right? So what I learned was I never felt like I was being heard or getting my way or whatever it was, because I wasn't acting. I had learned, basically over time, because I don't like conflict, so I don't say anything, or I feel guilty, so I don't say anything, right? So naturally, because I'm not doing those things aren't being done exactly the way I would want them to be done, say, right? And so then I end up being in a situation where my life is always reactionary.
Yeah.
It's, what's this person doing? And now I have to deal with that. Now I have to deal with this, rather than acting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, yeah, I mean, it's a little bit the sort of corny quote of like, be the change you want to see in the world. Yeah. Sounds like you have to be the change you want to see in relationships too. Because if you don't take a look at what can you do to shift the change, then if I'm not doing those things aren't going well, and then I'm just going to be reacting to what's coming back my way. I think that's one of the hardest things when people do any kind of family or maybe couples therapy or just are working on their relationships. Like, that's a huge shift when people make the shift in their mindset away from, this is the change that I want to see, And so here's what I expect or need the other person to do. So that changes when they can shift their mindset from that to what's within my control or what can I change to shift the dynamic, is a pretty big shift. And I mean, I think it's basically in line with becoming an actor rather than a reactor. No, of course, there's exceptions to every rule. There might be times where, if someone's in an actively like abusive relationship that, I wouldn't just expect someone to say, I'm going to change my behavior and then they'll stop being abusive. But, like if I'm afraid of this person leaving me or I feel insecure about that, expecting my partner to just sort of know that I feel that way and always make me feel better, for example, probably is not going to work. No, it's probably not going to get me what I want. Oh, no, that's not going to work. I mean, this reminds me, this was years ago, but I mean, when I was running, I think it was a couple session, I think one of the partners said, well, I just feel like I shouldn't have to say what I need. I think they should just know. And it's like, I hate to break it to you, but I don't think that's true. Like, I think you do have to be willing to take responsibility for your needs, be an actor and not just a reactor in that moment.
There is a mindset, though. I'm sure many people watching this, some of them perked up when you said that, but there is this mindset that if I have to tell you, then your relationship with me is not as genuine.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I think you're onto something. I think that's a belief that some people have.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen it over and over. Sure.
Yeah. And to that, I would say, that's a belief. And there's a judgment that we're placing on that we're saying the strength of someone's relationship is defined by how well they can guess and anticipate our needs. And there are maybe times that, many people have partners out there who are really good at that and can do that. And to that, I would say that's great and that's wonderful. But when we make that an expectation, or when we assume that that's the way they show that they love us or care about us, it's like you're kind of setting up a track and you're setting up a failure, I think. And also, it's like, yeah, it's kind of sounds simple, but like, hey, if you want something, what can you do to make it more likely to happen? It is a thing that I think people have to think about if you're going to step into the actor mindset.
Yeah, and that's when we have to go back to what my sponsor Guy told me so long ago. If you want a resentment, you just set an expectation.
That's great. That's a good one. Yeah, I like that. I bet there's all sorts of nuggets that you got.
So I can fill this room up full of nuggets.
Yeah. Well, we've come to the end here. This is the end of the laundry list. The great thing about the laundry list, if people haven't got the sense from us talking about it, there's a lot of depth in this stuff. We have made our best attempt, I think, at trying to give examples of each of these across the podcast, talk through things that might be, contributors. But certainly for me, as I've said, like, I'm not an expert on this stuff. I know a lot about it and I have lots of thoughts about it, but they're just my thoughts. The things that I love about this the most is when people get into the groups, they read this stuff and they see themselves in it. They apply it to themselves. They find their own examples in their own life. So if anyone's listening and hasn't actually gone through and read it themselves, please do.
Yeah, please do. And right. And you know what? If you've been following this thing along, or I would challenge you, because I'm curious about this. How many of you watching right now would like to talk about your experience where that, especially with the things that you can relate to in this laundry list? And certainly send us a comment about that. And maybe down the road, maybe we can do something with that.
Maybe. And I would also just say too that, like, I think a lot of people do get curious about this stuff, and they do get curious about their childhood. And yes, you can talk about that with an individual therapist. That's a great resource. But there is something I think really powerful about getting with more than one other person in a group and talking about it. Over and over, I see people, their faces kind of light up when they're like, oh, there's another person over there who's saying something, and I have had the exact same experience. There's something really cool about that connection. So yeah, final plug for it. If any of this stuff has resonated with you, be curious, be brave. Go check out a meeting too. You never know what you might get out of it.
Do it. You use Google for everything else.
Yeah.
Type in adult children of alcoholics meetings online.
You can find them.
You just might find something. So I'm Billy Hoffman,
I'm Steven Sweat.
and that is our ACA podcast.